Hey guys, Mr. Yisley here. So we are on to lesson number 1 in chapter 6, all about factoring. And we're going to talk specifically about how to find the greatest common factor, all right, the GCF. So how do we find the greatest common factor of a list of terms that they've given us? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to list all the factor pairs. So that's kind of like what we did there in our last 2 vocabulary words where we listed out. We're going to list out all those factor pairs. So again, like an example of this would be like if we had 6, we list out 1 times 6 and 2 times 3. Right? So we're going to list out the factor pairs. Right? Now, if we have variables involved, we're also going to list those out. So let's say, for instance, that this was 6a to the second power. Well, what does a to the second power, or a squared, means? It means a times a. So I'd list out 2 a's there, right? So that would be what I would do when I write out the variables. All right, so write out the variables. So that's the first step of finding the greatest common factor. And then obviously you would do that for each term that is listed. So if we had more than one term, you're going to have more than one list on there, right? Then we're going to find the largest common number in each list. My recommendation is always going to be start with the smallest term, right? The smallest number, all right, and check to see if it is in the other terms. So again, if like in our example with greatest common factor on the vocabulary, we had 6 and 12. We started at the 6 because that's the smaller number, and we looked to see if that was in 12, which it was. Now again, if it's not, then I would go down to the next biggest number in the list of 6, and I would look there and see. Because sometimes what you'll find out is that there's multiple numbers in common, all right, between the 2 lists. And so we always want to find the biggest one. So start with the smallest term and check to see, all right, if it's in the bigger one. Then you would do the same with variables, all right, what's the smallest amount of that variable that's there, all right, that's where we're going to go, all right. Right, and that's what we talked about right here. If that number you start with is in both lists, then you have the greatest common factor. If it's not, then keep going down that factor pair list until you find the greatest common factor. So a couple of shortcut things that you might want to take a look at. All right, these are just here for your reference. I'm going to move my paper up. All right. Just to remember, 1 is always a factor of all of them. So if you can't find any other number in common, then 1 is that number. 2 is a factor if the numbers end in 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. So if the number ends in 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, then 2 is a factor. 3 is a factor if the digits add to a multiple of 3. So like for instance with 12, if I add 1 plus 2, I get 3, right? And so that's a multiple of 3. So 4 is a factor if the last 2 digits are divisible by 4. So again, same idea there with just looking at the last 2 digits. 5 is a factor if it ends in 0 and 5. 6 is a factor if 2 and 3 are factors. 9 is a factor if the digits add to a multiple of 9. 10 is a factor if it ends in 0. So those are just some helpful things just to remind you of what's going on there, right? But they're not required. You don't have to use any of those. If you just prefer to go down the list, which is what I do, right? Then that's just fine. But if these will help you remember what numbers are factors of that term, then please use them to your advantage. All right, well, that's the basic process for greatest common factor. So now we're going to go on to lesson number 2 and learn how to use that process.